Hello and welcome back to Varn Vlog. Assuming you were with us before. So I am continuing our conversation about early Lasch and the crisis of 60s liberalism compared to now. In the last episode, Elijah and I uh, basically went through the history of the American left really fast in 30 minutes. I also talked about everything I thought was wrong about two books I really like. And then we compared the differences between the 60s crisis of American liberalism and its context with the current crisis of American liberalism and its context. And the only other thing I would add to that we didn't add in the last episode is the right-wing response and crisis of liberalism is more profound than it was then too. While there was a kind of reactionary right emerging, particularly in the South, in the character of George Wallace and kind of racial populism in the South, more or less, the conservative factions of both parties were okay with liberalism. They were just trying to deal with the problems of the financial crisis returning at the end of the 60s. That isn't the same now. There's a pretty strong and pronounced right-wing critique of liberalism, and that actually does end the nearly 150-year trend of most of the American right just being liberals from another decade. So I think that's a contextual difference that we didn't mention in episode 1 of early Lasch in the 60s crisis of liberalism, but we do need to mention today because I do think that's a complicated factor in things that we only briefly touched on, with the fact that if you meet young reactionaries, they're really reactionary, but they are rare. So with all that said, though, let's actually get into the two particular, essays that we wanted to talk about. And one is at the end of the Agony of the American Left, where Lasch is kind of spelling out what this all has meant leading up to the New Left in the 1960s. And let's remember when Agony was released. Once Agony came out in what, 68?
Agony came out in, let's say, is this the copy that has like no date on it? That's so frustrating. Yeah, let's say definitely post
69. It came out in 69. I just it's actually not in my copy either. I had to look it up online. But so Agony comes out at 69, so that's like the height of all this, really. And then World of Nations, which is we talked a lot about underread Lasch books. While there are essays in World of Nations that are well read, I think that entire book is a banger, and like
it's so good.
Even though it's like one-off essays and reviews, is structured in such a way to make an entire complete argument, right?
It's like it's basically like left-wing True and Only Heaven.
Yeah. As opposed to True and Only Heaven, which can't decide if it's left-wing or not.
Dubious. True and Only Heaven.
Yeah. But I think that leads us to talk about, what he sees happening in the 60s. So you wanted to talk about some specific essays in World of Nations. And I think one of them is the alternatives to American liberalism essay. And then the other one that I want to talk about, if you don't mind, that I think is relevant, is the end of cultural laissez-faire, which is also part of that. I think those are pretty much two pieces of the same argument.
Yeah, it's a different alternatives to liberalism is like the middle section of the book, and It's basically just like the New Left. And then the end of the cultural laissez-faire, birth, death, and technology is fantastic. Is that the same? Yeah, it is. It's one of my favorite essays in the book, and I think it is great because it points us to it points us to the fissure points that actually ended up happening and the cultural politics that ended up happening, rather than the cultural politics that Lasch wanted the New Left to go towards. Though obviously he cared about birth, death, and technology at the same time. So he starts the essay I wanted to talk about in Agony of the American Left with this Daniel Bell quote from The End of Ideology. "The ideological age has ended." That turned out not to be the case. Is the basic argument of the chapter, The Revival of Political Controversy in the 60s.
Right. I mean, basically, history, the argument that history ended, which is another discussion you and I will pick up later on a different episode, has been long with us. But Lasch goes, yeah, but I didn't get rid of ideologies, dude.
Yeah.
Like, and I think this period of post-war liberalism in America is the thing that feels most foreign to me. Like, it's hard for me to conceive of a time where there is that much ideological consensus between not just parties. I can kind of conceive that, but factions of American life. Like, that is really hard for me to put in. One of the things that I talk about, like when for example, right wingers will go, well, we're the counterculture now, and I'm like, no, you're not. Like, this is just divided cultural status quo. Like, there is no real counterculture now. It's been appropriated and resourced and recapitulated.
There's no culture,
right?
So there's no elegance.
Like you have niche subcultures, sure, but like, of which you are one of 1,000, my conservative friend. In so much that we have a political culture in America, it exists solely off of often pseudo polarization. So every administration increasingly justifies itself off crisis. That was also common in the time period Lasch is writing about, in the time period of cultural controversy into the 70s. Then there's the Michael Sandel period, and Michael Sandel really kind of sees the end of this cultural controversy as like the ascendancy of the administrative state, where we get the controversy, but it doesn't really affect anything because we farmed everything out to sub-departments in the executive that kind of run on their own. And that we try to keep these, like, politics is the cultural controversies, but it's not actually that. It's also just administrating this giant political apparatus, and those are two separate things. And I find it interesting because we know that Lasch was in dialogue with Sandel at one point. It shows up in a couple essays. But we are back in the crisis mode, and that is sort of this, like we were talking about, in the last episode, this continuity that kind of gets shaken up in 2007, 2008, but it's being shaken up by like the administrative state, effectively, like changes in the way we're operating the banks and this, that, and the other. It's not being shaken up in a way that like clearly is predictable. That's why you mentioned like Lindsey Graham's calling for the nationalization of banks with Bernie Sanders. It's a very weird time. And it's interesting also how quick we forgot that. Like, that is buried, that weird time period of like 3 years in the early Obama administration. And then we go back to the politics of cultural division with the Tea Party on forward, and people like, oh, well, the Tea Party's this. I'm like, well, the Tea Party's actually kind of a return to the moral majority shit too of the 90s. Like, it's not, that being new, it's more right wing than the moral majority stuff was, and also less based in reality, because in some real sense, like, the claim that the majority of the public was actually conservative during most of the baby boom was true. And that has not been true since the 2000s, increasingly young people are not. In fact, actually, for as far as we know about voting patterns, that's where the actual generational difference in voting patterns emerges for real, and that is in the 2000s, whereas priorly voting patterns were predictable off your parents. So I think that's okay. Those are all interesting things to talk about, but Lasch is pointing out that like this age of controversy doesn't actually seem to mean what, you know. Yes, Daniel Bell's right. The liberal consensus is over as an ideological apparatus, but the alternatives to it don't really actually catch on.
Well, they don't win.
Right.
Or I mean, I guess Nixonian conservatism wins, which is not the same as the liberal consensus of 8 years earlier, but
seems so much closer to it from this standpoint that liberal seems positively to the left of that Nixon seems positively to the left of Barack Obama. But
yeah,
I also agree that in the standpoint of like the Eisenhower to the Johnson administration, Nixon is a break.
Nixon's a break, and but definitely the most potent counter arguments to liberalism in the form of Barry Goldwater and the New Left are dispatched by the end of the 60s, or appear to be dispatched by the end of the 60s. And Lasch writes in The Revival of Political Controversy that a lot of this is internal to the New Left. So we've talked about some of the structural problems that happened in the last episode, but what Lasch really focuses on is that the New Left, and he says this on page 180, both the strengths and the weaknesses of the New Left derive from the fact that it is largely a student movement based on alienation. And it has an attempt basically to redefine the political issues as personal issues, that the political is personal, which is a big distinction from the cultural politics of the earlier 60s, which defined culture as basically like a private endeavor and didn't put cultural politics in the realm of political discourse at all. Unfortunately, what this culminates in Lasch's mind is the pivoting of the New Left from something that could be transformed into something, into a real political movement with the limitations of any political movement, into basically like a bunch of alienated kids who are trying to prove their authenticity by doing more and more radical street theater. Which is the conclusion he really comes to by the time he writes Culture of Narcissism. The New Left in this telling becomes nihilistic, despite the fact that in 1968, it's prior to knowing that they've been defeated. And he spends some time talking about the possibilities beyond this alienation in the form of either leaning into the contradictions within the university that he sees, or trying to harness the professional class or the conscious constituency of liberals by pointing out the necessity of an alliance purely on a defense of civil liberties between the left and liberals, which can then be used to, hopefully force liberalism to compromise with radicalism rather than the other way around. Though the postscript to Agony of the American Left says that this has failed because it's written at the 1968 Chicago Convention, and it talks about how, okay, our attempt to realign the Democratic Party in the form of the McCarthy and Kennedy campaigns is over. It's kaput. There is now no way to maintain the American empire under liberal auspices in this telling, which gets us now to World of Nations and the unraveling of this and the period of ennui and crisis that we said feels so familiar to us today.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I think that he he definitely clearly spares out in World of Nations is this increasing cultural need to prove oneself radical through acts of personal rebellion, transgression, etc., which I think we see only accelerate up into the 90s. I mean, again, I do think of like the left that I came out of before I became a conservative, like the left of my teens that I was exposed to as a working class kid, was like tied up into the punk movement and arts movements and narratives about the 70s and you know, breaking out of your religious background for the most part, tied up into weird shit like Wicca, like, and the personal as political was like, I think it was fully inverted by that point, where the political was seen as pretty much personal, and personal rebellion was pretty key to it all. This changes in the alter globalization movement a little bit around the battle for Seattle, etc. But you know, prior to that, what the left was a kind of a conglomeration of personal special interest and or identitarian politics. And by identitarian, I don't mean like, yes, there was anti-racism and that sort of stuff, but it was more, I mean, like literally you're adopting the identity of leftist.
Mm-hmm. It's a way of countering alienation by saying, I'm part of something.
Right. I'm part of this group. I learned about the left through the reading list in the back of the Rage Against Machine CD.
Which includes Culture of Narcissism.
It does, ironically enough. But, you know, it includes that reading list. Actually, I still go back and look at it and I'm like, that's weird. I sometimes wonder, actually, if that's where it first encountered Lasch.
That would be hilarious. There should be a series that you have on purely just Rage Against the Machine reading list.
Well, I also learned about Shining Path from them. So, but, you know, but by the odds that we were already making fun of them as Rage Against pretty much everything, because it wasn't clear, you know, yes, there's radical Marxist books in this list, but like Tom Morello ends up being just a bog standard Obama liberal, right? Like, and Zach De La Rocca kind of disappears. Like, so, I bring all this up because though that is the left of the 90s. It's the left of people a little bit older than me. It's the left of people like Doug Lane. It's tied up into zine culture. It's tied up into these fragmented post-70s counterculture movements that were often quite strange and sometimes only on the internet, like Discordianism or, you know, the Church of Bob, or these sorts of weird things. And then there was like the Green Party left, which you know, had a history. It comes out of the failure of exactly what Lasch is talking about, but it's, you know, so thoroughly failed by the 1990s. It's like kind of a joke, even though it's a mass party in some senses. It's, you know, its membership base is larger than the DSA at one point for sure. Mm-hmm. Even though we don't talk about it because it doesn't really do anything. So I say all this to say, like, it's not that there was no left during the 90s. There's, you know, the Gen X left. It's not that it didn't exist, but it was super fucking fragmented. And that seems to be a symptom of what Lasch is talking about here. Like, what if you've given up on a class narrative or any kind of collective narrative, what's going to hold you together other than like temporary interest groups and cultural affiliations? And pretty much nothing. Like, what do you take on that? Like, because, you know, I'm trying not to read this also in light of like Lasch's, like,
I mean, I think that one of the big changes between the postscript
mm-hmm.
in Agony of the American Left and the things he's responding to in World of Nations is that at the end of Agony of the American Left, he's identifying the possible constituencies for a left movement, which exists beyond a need for identification. It's just like, if you're a part of these groups, you'll be drawn to the left. This ended up not happening, but it's, students, the conscience constituency of liberals, possibly professionals, Black people, ethnic minorities, the poor. It's the usual hodgepodge, which has not succeeded in becoming, a natural constituency of the left. But what doesn't happen is what Lasch calls for more explicitly in World of Nations, which is the foundation of a new party to educate these groups and collect their support. And so there's no place for people to go beyond zine culture and beyond temporary sectarian organizations, because there is no mass left politics following, certainly the defeat of McGovern in 1972 up until maybe the Jesse Jackson campaign. But it's pretty absent. And Jesse Jackson himself is not as successful in reshaping American politics more broadly as even Bernie Sanders, who's not particularly successful at it. So basically, where is there to go? Nowhere, because nothing has been built.
All right. And yet now we live in a time where something's been built, but it's still going nowhere. And, we talked about in the beginning, that I trace at least 4 attempts over the course of a century and 2 decades to actually a century and 3 decades, because it really starts in the 1890s, to kind of take over the Democratic Party. And in the first case, in the William Jennings Bryan case, that doesn't even seem like the obvious party you try to take over. It feels like maybe you go into the Republicans, the radical Republicans were almost socialist anyway. That's only 20 years ago at this point. But that's not where they go. That's kind of an accident of history and local politics, and religion, because it is tied into William Jennings Bryan's Christianity. We talk about the real shift with both the progressives, having changed the Democratic Party to where it's not just a reactionary party. It's reactionary, but also not simultaneously. And that's also true for the Republicans. So it makes some more sense. And with Roosevelt being in power, the New Deal, the labor movement already being kind of headed in that way anyway. And then the Popular Front happens and consolidates the left, continuing along those paths, with the exception of some Trotskyists and some very ultra leftist. Okay, that's a thing. Then we hit the attempt in the late 60s, which was what Lasch has said definitively loses and can't really be tried again, by 1974 ish. And then he talks about the culture of narcissism, which we are trying not to bring too much in, but it's sort of his explanation of what happens next in the fragmentation of Fordism and what that means culturally in the long 70s. And by the long 70s, we really mean 69 through 1982. So that means, to me, I'm left with this. Well, of course, the Gen X left was the way it was. And particularly when you add things that hadn't even happened yet into it, like the fall of the Soviet Union, the rise of the Atari Democrats into the DNC, into Clintonism, and then it also happening across the pond and kind of happening in Canada all at the same time, or roughly the same time. Although in Canada it took really, Trudeau is the figure that kind of is their Blair, and he seems like he might be in power forever. So who knows? But it does definitely, that happens across the board in the English speaking world. And in some ways it makes sense from the world Lasch describes at the end of the New Left period, that that's what would happen, even before we get to Culture of Narcissism, where he's trying to go into the psychology of it. and the extent in which the depoliticization happens. Because I don't think he totally sees like the weird left of the 80s either. It catches him off guard a lot.
Well, he doesn't see the left collapsing as absolutely as it did.
Well, I mean, and in so much that like he kind of abandons Marxism, for example. Not that he was ever a hard Marxist, but he was a loosely speaking one, from what I can tell, until the 80s, because like he's like, these Trotskyist groups that still exist, they're always bringing the working class, like they're just explaining everything in terms of false consciousness, and these other people are basically saying these people are stupid and conservative and we shouldn't deal with them, and their problems aren't real. The problems of, you know, the crisis of progressive education, like it's just like, no, that's not real. It doesn't affect, you know, it's not important. The breakdown of the family is not important. And
here he talks about law and order as
right. Well, and that makes sense. I mean, I don't think even Lasch could have imagined the law and order backlash leading to the carceral state that actually emerges in the late 70s, early 80s.
His like descriptions here are like, we must have more jobs and better education and remove corruption from the police force, and then we'll be able to do law and order.
Right, which is like, okay, you know,
not anything we would imagine as law and order, or like law and order politics. I mean,
no, I mean his law and order politics is very much like, you know, it's in one sense it's like, you know, yeah, we could have it, but we have to like reincorporate all these people who you made surplus population. He doesn't use that language by the 70s. He does use it in the 60s, but it very much seems to be the case, you know, like, well, all this has clearly failed, and he you know, his next projects in the middle period, I think, indicate his trying to deal with that. One is dealing with the crisis of the family, and that's where I'm like both the most and the least sympathetic to him at the same time. I think what he's describing as a crisis of the family is very real, and I think what he's describing as the kind of feminism that actually ends up winning by the 70s is also very real. Something that like radical feminists now will call white feminism, but, you know, really should probably be called bourgeois middle class feminism, because it's not just white. But again, the reason why I'm less sympathetic to them is he's got this weird transhistorical notion of family that like he thinks is anthropologically justified, which absolutely is not. Like, and that is one of the points where I think people accusing him of having some conservative instances are actually correct. Like, and I've talked about this at length in his Cocoon essays. It's like become infamous because that's where he like breaks with the left. Formally, I guess that's in 88, right? But he's also right that the left had given up talking. I mean, like it's hard to put ourselves back into the 80s left, but like even the sectarian groups that are around. So by the time you get to the 80s, anti-revisionism is morphing into like Maoist third worldism. So it's like totally, we only care about shit elsewhere because our working class is utterly reprobate.
I feel like some of that has been like
it's come back.
Yeah, it's kind of come back. Like the campus left when I was at school shifted like during the time I was there from freshman year being like, we'll knock doors for Bernie, to like my senior year, there being like fissures within the like more like pro-Biden and less pro-Biden wing of like the progressives, and then there being like a third worldist reading group on campus, basically.
Yeah, I saw that too, and I
helped found and then was expelled from for being too revisionist.
Shame on you.
Which is so funny. Anyway,
but what is funny to me is that again, that's a mirror of the late 70s, 80s. This has happened before, and exactly in that order too.
I think, Yeah, I mean, a lot of it is tied. It's just tied with powerlessness, I think, in large part, and that I think I think Lasch is right that a lot of his writings about the work ethic and discipline and the need for compelling work and compelling politics, that people want to take care of themselves, and if they're not given the chance to take care of themselves on the left, in the context of exercising real power and real politics, they'll do it in the context of pretty meaningless power and meaningless politics, in the sense that it can't affect anything, but you have your ideological purity and your cohesion and your internal focus and the idea that you're keeping something alive. And you might be, I don't know. It just hasn't blossomed out of any of these groups into broader society ever in the United States. Which isn't to say that it won't. It's just that I don't think it's particularly likely.
Yeah, I mean, well, one of the things that it usually involves for me is the romanticization of other places, and often a tendency towards victimology and degenerating into moralism. And one of the things about third worldism for that, and this is not to say that there's not parts of third worldist description of reality that haven't been true in the past, but it's funny because by the time it comes up in the 1980s, it's already kind of not true.
Yeah.
If you want to talk about super exploitation and all that definitely exists, but it's not going on the way that they're describing it. Labor aristocracy isn't broken up on national lines. It's really broken up on core and periphery industry lines and regions, and it's even within the same country, etc. And so this is not super explanatory anymore, but people are really attracted to it because they still think in terms of states. And that's the irony of World of Nations too. Actually, I want to talk a little bit about that title, because that title is not obvious.
Well, it's talking about civil society,
right?
And it's using the Vico quote from his New Science. There's actually this great in the explanation in the way back of the book. I don't know if you've ever read this. But he has a reflection on the title where he talks about how Vico was trying to bring about a technology of politics almost, in the same way. And he writes this thing about Darwin and Marx also. Wait, I'm digging this up. It's one page. Okay, it's a little longer. But basically he talks about how Marx we'll get to this some other time, because I'm not it's not as communicable as I imagined. Oh, no. Here it is right here. So he has this reflection, and he has this little sentence, as Marx once wrote when he noted the need for a critical history of technology that would do for human culture what Darwin's work has done for nature's technology. And would not such a history be easier to compile since, as Vico says, human history differs from natural history in this, that we have made the former, but not the latter. So I just think it's such that little hint about, or not hint, it's an explanation about what he's thinking with the title is so great, that he's looking for in Marxism a technology of history that he's applying here in his own way to civil society as raised originally by Vico, even though of course he's so anti-positivistic and critical of technology. I guess he means it here more in the sense of technique.
Social technology.
Yeah, that was a complete aside. It was completely irrelevant to the topic.
No, I mean, but it's interesting to me because I've always like pondered whether to be quote like the world of nations, what's he invoking there, and what people are trying to get out of, and it does seem interesting to me that like one of the centerpieces of the book, or the piece we're talking about, there, the alternatives to liberalism, and then the is revolution obsolete piece. Those are the two. That's the center of that book, like literally the center of that book, and part of the problem that the left has is how to conceive of itself, not just when it's lost its national it's kind of national politics and collective project, but also that it like this idea of a transnational left is both more possible because of communication and less possible because of the strength of states. And that's in the background of all this. It's not something he writes directly about, except in the piece about George Kennan. But it's in the background of all these essays. And so, I kind of, as we talk about the crisis of liberalism, one of the things that we see right now that was not really at play in the 60s was a call for a new nationalism, like a real new nationalism. Like a return to the old god style of nationalism. Like that was not, I can't think of, even George Wallace wasn't really doing that.
Yeah.
Yes, white supremacism was definitely, but even white supremacism wasn't really white nationalism. Interestingly enough. Like, because in some ways they didn't need it, honestly. Another thing that like Lasch we never get the Lasch really right about is the effect of the immigration changes of the 1980s, which are done by Reagan, which is kind of ironic given the long spectrum of American politics, right? But like I think he's dead before that's really a major.
They're started by Johnson.
Huh? They're started by Johnson?
Yeah.
They're really accelerated under Reagan. Like that's when the numbers
he does
jump dramatically. Right. I mean, because Johnson gets rid of like the racial quotas and whatnot, but like the immigration regime fundamentally changing does not actually happen till the 80s. And what does that mean? Like, because we can't deny that that's a big driver in the current crisis of liberalism. It's what drives a lot of the Great Replacement conspiracy theories, but it's also driven a lot of like, let's be honest, there's a whole lot of triumphalism assumed for about 15 years in the Democratic Party for it, that a less white America necessarily meant that they won, which is actually where the Great Replacement conspiracy theory came from. It was like the literalization and conspiracization of left liberal rhetoric.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know that people really want to deal with that, but it's true. Like, and you first see that, the first place you see that is actually in the David Duke campaign. And then it really accelerates at the end of the Bush administration. Particularly once, Bush's own party pushes against his attempt to do another Reagan and be the person who actually does immigration reform. And you see this massive backlash to that. That backlash is part of what leads to the Tea Party, although there's also the last gasp of evangelical politics in the Tea Party and some other stuff, and just some racism, but some other stuff too. There's also tax protesting that's part of the early part that fades away and stuff like that. And they were tax protests against a Republican, by the way. I think people forget that part of it. But that it's so interesting to try to, when we try to like, I talked in the beginning, and in some ways, like, I have thought that this feels like the 70s since the end of the Bush administration. I have actually said that, like, over and over and over again. Like, this feels like the way everyone describes the 70s to me. And yet it feels like the 70s in reverse for me. I felt like we went through like the Bush period, which was like a Nixon period. Then we had like a Kennedy who didn't die, and Obama, and then we had like the new left, but from the backwards trajectory. I remember even like I used to joke about it right before Occupy. I used to call it like the search for a new left. Like,
yeah, now they've all folded back into consensus liberalism.
Right. And the DSA doesn't really seem to be like a what you see happen is two things, and I think you can kind of see this in two different movements. The disappearance of Michael Brooks and Jamie Peck from the Majority Report. So that's like a back to the that's the aughts progressive norm of like Air America Radio that generated the original Majority Report and TYT anyway. And yes, they'll talk to Marxists and talk to left-wing scholars, but like they're Democrats and we all know it. And this like revanchist Marxism that like is like, well, yeah, but you know, the aggressive parts of Stalinism, that's the best part. Like the best part is when during war communism, they reimposed the family and banned abortion. Like, and I'm like, okay. And also racial nationalism is good. Just like, not just for white people though. Everybody gets one. And I'm like, okay. I feel like there's a Mr. Show sketch from the 90s making fun of this very proposition, but whatever. And so when you kind of realize that, and you look at now and you go, okay, like, is this in some strange way like the end of a cycle that actually began with our grandparents with Lasch? Like, is this cycle that long?
Is it just that the boomers are finally leaving American politics?
Right. But I mean, and in some ways, I hate to give Chris Catrone credit for a whole lot, but he wrote a somewhat insightful essay in his Death of the Millennial Left book about how Bernie Sandersism was actually the vindication of the post-New Left 80s left that had just been kind of sitting in the background, biding its time. It was all the younger baby boomers who weren't really part of the New Left anyway, but they had that mythology and they kind of came of age in the 80s and did a little bit and then fell back for 2 whole decades or 3 whole decades, really. And then, you know, who comes to lead the left now, this whole new looful left, is a bunch of fucking 80-year-olds. Like, I mean, in some ways, literally, it's the same people. Like the fact that like all these categories, I talked to you about this with PMC. PMC comes from this time period, right? It's a problem of this time period. It's a concept that is dropped. You don't hear anyone but Adolf Reed talking about it for like 40 years. And it's picked back up around 2017 to explain the first Bernie loss and then really catches on after the second Bernie loss. Right? But in some ways, it feels like we're just going through this shit backwards. Like, and then, yeah, like I always talk about, okay, all American generational politics are bullshit, except for the baby boomers. That's a material reality in the United States. It has to do with the post-war boom. It literally changed every fucking institution in our society was built for them. And they're utter narcissists. And they kind of got the benefit from both neoliberalism and Fordism, and no one else did. Like, not both of them.
At some point, you just got to respect it.
Right. So, like, does this mean that the next flight won't resemble this? Have we finally given up going into the Democratic Party? The weird thing that I find about it is that a lot of people who oppose working with the Democrats under Obama, off of the lessons that they supposedly learned from the time period Lasch is writing about, supported it under Biden. And that's the harder thing to explain.
I mean, my take on this is that the boundaries of American politics, like as in who's voting for who, has looked remarkably similar from 1968 until basically like, 10 years ago, in that it's like a general trend of like suburbanites being Republicans, and now they're like not doing that anymore. And if this whole like green capital thing succeeds in dramatically reshaping the political economy of of America, something different might happen. I don't know. I have no idea. It's going to take work. It's not going to be like a natural result of just like changing, populations. But there are new opportunities, possibly. I don't know. I have no idea. Personally, I think the reason why people have switched from not wanting to work with Obama to wanting to work with Biden is probably just because of the trauma of Trumpism and the fact that they're so despondent about the possibility of an independent left doing anything.
I mean, it does kind of leave the left with nothing to do, because one of the things that I think this is different. After the 70s, there wasn't a lot of leftists saying we should tail Reagan. Like we should have the leftist version of Reaganism. That was not a thing.
There wasn't anti-bureaucracy movement. And then, of course, there was the neoconservatives who were...
But this wasn't a tailist movement. This is just outright betrayal.
Okay. Yeah, I guess that's it. That's true.
Like when you turned in the 80s, you turned, right? Now there's people who want to maintain their Marxist identity, but follow Republican politics to some degree. At a time when Republican politics seems... It's weird because I've had arguments with like platypus people around this where they're like, well, the Republicans still talk about how they believe in liberty and whatnot. And I'm like, no, they don't. Like you seem to be talking about the Republicans of 10 years ago.
Yeah. I mean, like, I think they're like way worse in basically every way than they were like 20 years ago, which is hard to do.
Right. The fact that people get nostalgic about, I mean, hell, let me put it to you this way. Even Trump seems pretty fucking moderate from the standpoint of what is coming out of the Republican Party now. He just kind of does.
Well, he is what's coming out of the Republican Party now.
I don't think so. I think what we have now is like a parody of him. Like he's like, but he like Trump would never do what Ron DeSantis is actually doing.
In Florida, you mean?
Yes. He might do it now, but that was never on his agenda. He would pick up that stuff if it suited him kind of superficially, but it was not the primary goal of what he wanted to do.
Yeah. I mean, I think the whole thing about him is that he doesn't have any primary goals beyond like just like being there, kind of.
I sometimes wonder if that's your generation's like cope, that you think that there's not an agenda there.
I just think Trump's a moron, personally. I think there's tons of people around him who have like insane like goals. And I think that he's enabled, I think he picked up on a lot of undercurrents in the Republican Party that he tapped into and now give him support and that he now supports. But I don't think there's like anything substantive about him personally.
No, I mean, well, that's part of the interesting thing about talking about the right today or what conservatism is today is no one fucking knows.
Yeah. No, it's just like it's like a black box. Like you look in there and it's like, what's going on?
But because also like when Trump is gone, it's not clear what replaces him because like the Ron DeSantis agenda is not really the Trump agenda, even though it's like
if he lives as long as his parents, he'll be alive in 2032.
Woot.
So just imagine if he's our like era's William Jennings Bryan, where he's running for every election. Trump nomination 2024, Trump nomination 2028, Trump nomination 2032, and he dies on the campaign trail. That's really what this country deserves.
I mean, it'll save the Democratic Party, won't it?
I mean, it would. It'd be very good if that happened for my mother's mental health in some ways, but not others. Because she'd have to continue looking at Donald Trump. But that's not.
But like in this current crisis of liberalism, what has been amazing actually is we no longer know what conservatism is. We increasingly don't really know what the left is. It had a moment of clarity for the first time since probably the time period that Lasch was writing about, and it's over. And it seems more weird, way more weird than in the past.
Mm-hmm. Well, if the tendency of a desire to heighten alienation is still true, America is a much more welcoming place in many ways of many different political persuasions and cultural ideas than it used to be. So you have to reach farther out if you want to stay alienated.
Exactly, which is why Twitter is a fucking weird hellscape, and why stuff like esoteric Hitlerism and
whatever is
popular. Yeah, and like Yakiism.
And it's not true, I want to say, also of just the left. This is also true of the right. Everybody,
no, the right,
they're all super weird.
The right is more. I'd actually argue, and I know a lot of leftists disagree with me because they've never been on the right. I actually argue that the right's been suffering an identity crisis since the Bush administration. Since the middle of the Bush administration, it was clear that neoconservatism was over, but it was not clear what the hell was going to replace it. Which is why the actual Trump administration, not the one people like Christian Parenti want to clean up, and I like some of Christian Parenti's writings. I'm not totally against everything he says, but this reviewing Trump. Yeah, Trump had an aversion to war. I actually do think he had a personal aversion to war, but he also did not have enough of an aversion to keep the last bastion of the worst end of the neocons, out of his cabinet. Like, he replaced paleo-conservative, anti-war people with people like John Bolton.
Yeah.
Which also tells me that Trump's lizard brain couldn't figure out what even the GOP wanted as a compromise to stay in power.
I mean, this lends credence to my he's just an idiot theory.
I think he's a lizard brain genius, but that doesn't preclude him being an idiot.
Yeah, I guess that's true.
Lizard brain and forebrain are very different things when we're talking about Trump.
I guess that's true.
Whereas someone like Ron DeSantis is petty forebrain. He does not actually have the lizard brain. He's all like calculated cruelty and he's not charismatic.
No, there's nothing natural about the way he moves.
Right. But this whole thing that even I used to say, that the fear of we should all be afraid of what comes after Trump because it might actually be coherent and or smart. So far, that hasn't paid out.
Which I'm
kind of grateful for.
But yeah. Though again, with the same way that we said in the last episode that we'll know if neoliberalism has been replaced in about 10 years. We'll know if we should be grateful for that in about 10 years.
Right. We'll know once post 3032 Trump corpse, running again around 80 goes away because he just dies of natural causes at 104 or something. And because of genetics and spite.
And he doesn't drink.
Yeah, that does help. People are always like, oh, he eats like crap. I'm like, yeah, but he doesn't drink. That does kind of
Did you hear on the recording of this? We're recording this right after the recording of him doing his secret document bullshit came out. And at the end of the recording, the last thing you hear is, hey, can you bring a couple of Cokes in? Which is so funny. I
mean,
feel like
what? I actually, that's one of the things that Trump does that I'm actually sympathetic for, because when I quit drinking, I also became a
Coca-Cola fiend.
Yeah, I mean, not sugar Coke. I like him drink non-sugar variety, but not diet. I prefer zero. But still, yes, I am a, and if when I try to quit Cokes, I drink fizzy water. Like, that's what I drink.
I like fizzy water.
I'm down with the fizzy water.
Podcast.
I'm down with the fizzy water, and I like tea, but like I have discovered that I still drink copious amounts of stuff now that I don't really drink alcohol that much. And it's just like, no, still have the habit, but it just it's no longer as debilitating.
This is why you and Trump will outlive us all.
You know, I do look pretty young to be 40 something. I will say that. So I guess this leads me though to this like real serious paradox for me that we've talked about. Liberalism's in crisis again. We know from last time that it changed significantly during the long 70s into the horror show that it became during all of my lifetime. We have no idea what the fuck is going on right now. So, for example, I have been pretty good at predicting elections for most of my life. I predicted Obama. I predicted Biden. Actually, the only part of it is I didn't predict Georgia, which is funny because it's my home state. But and yet, more than any other time in my life, I feel like not only do I feel like we're going back to a like 60s, 70s era of like short-term presidencies for a variety of reasons. I also have no idea how it's going to play out. Like, it really does feel like a black box. Like all these baby boomer standards and institutions and stuff are really falling apart. And
there's nothing coming up to replace them.
Right. And I mean, I also think for those of you who want to like really get my real dark things, I think that's true in the international scale too. Like, BRICS, whatever. Like, BRICS is not actually even trying to replace the transatlantic superstate. Maybe that's good. Maybe it's, maybe that's terrible. But it's happening. We don't know what it means.
Our Fukuyama episode.
Yep. We'll come back to this because it'll be important in our Fukuyama episode. But it's like, so we have this undead liberalism that like is in crisis, and we've been talking about it being in crisis since the end of the Bush administration, really. Right? Think about Fareed Zakaria, the crisis, the multipolarity and the crisis of the post-American world. Like, which is a liberal book, and that's predicting a crisis of liberalism because of geopolitical reasons and the change of world markets. But that's in 2007. And we've been kind of stuck in this zombie world where the center that we keep on predicting is going to die and has no organic base. Like, this is what's so interesting about now. The center before had the largest chunk of American political support, really did, even in the 90s and the beginnings of the aughts. It started to slip at the late 90s. Now it's like 10% of the population and only rules because nobody else can really dominate anything, like because there is no dominant counter tendency, but it's actually a minority position in the electorate. And that's a real, like, that's some weird, like, king shit. But I mean, like, you know what I mean by king shit? Like, oh, this is a singular faction that's able to dominate because it plays other factions off of each other. Like, not because it actually has an organically strong base or even a strong base in the government. Like,
it has a permanent veto slot over what goes on anywhere in the legislative state. At the national level, I should say, not at the state level.
Which is interesting because that happens in continental European periphery countries like Italy, but it doesn't tend to happen in countries like Britain or the United States. And that also, like, look at Britain. Like, the Tories are more unpopular than ever, but like it's not clear with it. This new labor is going to be any different than a Tory government. Like, in fact, they're trying to argue like we're the real conservatives, and I'm like, oh my god,
we'll do law and order and do tax cuts.
Right. It's just like okay, so you're just arguing. I mean, it is kind of like Clintonism again. Like you're arguing our Blairism from the British perspective. That the Corbyn experiment lost so bad and only came to power by accident anyway that we're just never going to do that again. But also, like, if people think America's poorly run, Britain is a shit show. Like, its inflation is way higher than ours. Its unemployment is way higher than ours. It has no real industrial policy to speak of. It, like, doesn't even clearly have clear trade partners of which it can clearly integrate with anymore. Like, it's not, it's, you know, it's like, oh yeah, we're like, America needs British goods. Really? It's, we'll take your tea, I guess. I mean, it's not, it in some ways actually is kind of the model for what the worst case scenario of the United States could become. Yeah. But and in some ways I'm also interested in the fact that we don't really know what's going to happen in the United States, because on paper, from a material standpoint, we're still set up pretty good. That's the thing. Like, yes, we're having crop problems. We're having less than other parts of the world. Yes, we are having troubles with reorienting, but we have a huge trade network with friendly country neighbors in both directions that's really highly integrated.
We've just like thrown a ton of money at, like, you know, oversupply of computer chips and energy policy, you know, and we're an oil exporter. You know,
we're a breadbasket.
We're a breadbasket. There's a lot of advantages to America's position in the world economy, definitely.
And yet we seem like, I have almost thought about this as a challenge to my Marxist materialism, because I'm like, yet it seems like we're insane. Like that, like by every material input, we should be perfectly able to handle this current reorientation and crisis pretty well. We're way better than like Britain at the end of its empire, which is a fucking island.
It's the national soils thing that we've been joking about.
Yeah, it's like something's happened in the fragmentation of the baby boomer culture that's like made it impossible to run our fucking society. And in that sense, like, I have to take Lasch, to bring it back to Lasch in a very real way, somewhat seriously, that this cultural stuff is not just like an epiphenomenal superstructure. It is very much tied into the structure of material life in a way that you cannot ignore it. And if you do, you're going to be horribly wrong.
Well, we replaced you know, we knew we had to do that because we replaced a baby boomer president with a silent generation president.
Oh man, this is the revenge of the olds before they all die.
So true.
I mean, it was funny because it's like there was this trend until Trump of like after Reagan presidents getting younger and younger. Clinton, then Bush, then Obama, all being fairly young presidents, right? I think Obama will be probably our only Gen X president.
He's not technically Gen X.
Oh, he's a boomer too?
Technically, yeah.
I think he's in that weird he is to boomers like I am to Gen X.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think like the basic point from before I made that crack is true. Like, there's something weird that's captured in this description of the politics of the 60s, which we keep coming back to because it defines our world and it defines the cultural framework of our world and the reason why it's not able to operate at any level for some reason. And it's the reason, in some sense, why we're trapped, or at least it's something we're trapped in.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that leads us in a kind of dismal place in a lot of ways. But on a side note, I don't think it's a dismal place that's going to last a lot longer. I just think any left that still exists is going to have to be pretty open to just being honest and saying we don't know what the hell is going on because all of our priors are shot, right? Like, and I also think I want to float this by you though. One thing that Platypus did actually instillate to me is they once challenged me to say you'll see people pulling to earlier and earlier portions of the left. Now, I also challenge them and say I think we'll see the rebirth of weird Stalinism for people to differentiate themselves with the DSA as a manifestation of their own alienation and powerlessness once Bernie inevitably loses, which I was right about. But they told me to look at, you'll see people go further and further back. So you'll see, and I think that's been true too. So like people like, we're going to revive the left with neo-Kautskyism. What's neo-Kautskyism? Pre-1917 Marxism.
Mm-hmm.
And this was also a tendency of the new left. It was like, oh, let's go back to like the First International or whatever. Like we want to go back to the period before this all got ugly and hard to deal with and actually involved real states and whatnot. I think we'll see a little bit more of that before it's over. Like, I think that's even true in this like current attempt to revive the People's Party in some weird left-right alliance. Because I'm like, we're going back to the 19th century. You don't have any of the same class base at all. Like, where's this coming from? Because you seem to be confusing cultural positions with a class-based position, like in a real sense.
They're trying to tap into the vibes of yesteryear.
Right. It's very much a vibes-based argument. Like, well, but the working class, they're not like PMC liberals. They have blue collar vibes, and like peasant sharecropper vibes. Really?
Hey, I mean, this is the reason why, like, some argument is just vibes. If it boils down to it, like a lot of the most interesting strains of debate on the left now, and on the academic left specifically, are basically vibes. It's like, right. What do you do with tech? What do you do with Biden? What do you do with Trump? Well, we have no answer, so it's just vibes. And then we'll, use some figures to justify those vibes. And I think what you got to do is you got to just learn to love the vibe. Though I can say that because I'm, I'm just very aware of the fact that the left lost, or the type of the left that inspired me to get into the left in the first place, 5 years ago or 6 years ago, whatever, is over. And there'll be something at some point, but in the meantime, we just got to ride the wave.
I think that's a fair enough point, and we can end on that. All right.